Just a bit of history. The whole idea of Soundbox was actually built around the ideas behind the museum. It's a little strange in some ways to have this situation now, because the whole idea of the museum was that there should always be something happening in it. And even the name Soundbox came from the idea that I wanted this space to always have sound in it. What I'm going to talk about today is going to leap from initially this space and why I find what's around me interesting, into something which I've already kind of flagged up with you, the question of cycles. It's interesting talking to a lot of you with regard to your portfolios. How much the question of what it is, why we choose certain music to play, how we make those choices and how we work on it really fascinates me. And if we're composers, of course, what we choose to compose, effectively, how do we make our musical world? So it's, for me, a good thing to begin in this room. So this is going to be kind of soft beginning while people come in here, because if I hold up the violin, which is always with me here, this is the 1629 Girolamo Amati. If I then turn the camera like this, the instrument in the case here, the 1662 Niccolo Amati, that one just there, is made, not only is it made by the son of Girolamo, the back of this instrument was most likely made by Niccolo, who's over there. And of course, if you go to the case right back there, at the back of the room, you'll find an instrument made by Girolamo Amati II, who is Niccolo Amati's son. There's two, but one important maker missing from the line there, and that's Andrea Amati, the father of Girolamo, who in the 1560s basically can be said to have finalized the modern form of the violin. And of course, we take it a stage further. Niccolo Amati's greatest legacy in some ways was the legacy of his great disciple, and that's Antonio Stradivari. And so if we go in order, we have this instrument here is 1629, and the one there, the Niccolo, is 1666, 1662. The viola over there, the Arquinto viola, is a mid-life viola by Antonio Stradivari from 1696. And the instrument over here, the Viotti violin, is from 1709. And right in the far case over there is an instrument that Stradivarius made in his 90th year in 1734. So just in the stretch of 3 generations here, or 4 generations, we show instruments stretching for over of a century, but a clear line of succession. The reason I wanted to begin with this is I want to begin with a kind of upbeat link to this instrument and a little bit to our present situation. We're living in a time of, well, a little bit linked, and you'll see why it's only a little bit linked. Now, the violin is labelled, and I want to bring this up, inside as being by the brothers Antonio Girolamo Amati. Now, these were both the 2 sons of Andrea Amati, who I mentioned earlier, the kind of person who's the progenitor of the violin. And that model that he invented was going to be made by everybody through Stradivarius and every maker of note since. Fundamentally, the design of the violin has not changed since 1565. Now, the label inside the instrument here, which you won't be able to see, really makes claim to that lineage. It describes the brothers, Antonio and Girolamo. So Girolamo is 1561 to 1630, and Antonio is the older brother, 1540 to 1610. Describes them as being nepoti, which can translate as either descendants or nephews of Andrea, despite the fact that they were actually his sons. And the 2 of them collaborated under the label brothers until 1588. Just to get that into context, if you're from the UK, that's the year of the Spanish Armada. in the middle of the reign of Elizabeth I, or Philip, and a time of Philip II of Spain. But Girolamo, although he was working by himself, went on using the joint label, and from 1610 he was joined in the workshop by his then 13-year-old son Niccolo. And the real consensus is that until Girolamo's death, the two of them worked together on most of their most instruments. It's not. Bear in mind that you learned to do any craft, whether it was instrument making or composing or playing. You learned effectively through apprenticeship in these days. So you became an apprentice usually at 10 or 11. So Girolamo, working in the workshop and working on instruments seriously by his mid-teens, wouldn't have been of note. This also means, however, that the earliest labelled instruments you get by specific makers usually tend to be when they complete their apprenticeship, normally around their 18th or 17th year. So the earliest labelled violin we have by Antonio Stradivari is from 1666, when he was 18. But, and this is where it gets a bit topical, the general consensus is that most of the violins which emerged from the Amati workshop, as I said, were from the time that his son Niccolo joins Girolamo, were shared instruments. And this ended, of course, with a catastrophic plague which swept through Italy in 1629 to 1630. Now, this tends to be talked out in kind of, well, to be honest, rather vague terms. Historians of the violin have a tendency only to read the same books they all read, and they don't tend to go outside the standard research. So I decided to spend some time looking in the epidemiological history of the 17th century, and I was really horrified to find what I found. The plagues which swept through southern and northern Europe in 1629 to 1630 was actually the worst plague in Europe since the Black Death of that back in the 1340s. Now, of course, the Black Death probably killed around or over 1/3 of the population of Europe in the 1400s. And the plague arrived in Italy in October 1629, and it was brought by Spanish and French troops who were involved in fundamentally a Habsburg war, the so-called War of the Mantuan Succession. And the disease spread very quickly southwards, all over the northern Italian peninsula. Of course, Italy as a country didn't exist until 1870. The only places it didn't hit badly were bits of Liguria and to the west in Piedmont. But by the late spring, it got to Tuscany and it stopped. Now, the reason I want to bring this up is the death rates. The death rates in the northern Italian cities, such as the main cities in Cremona, such as Brescia, and in Lombardy, such as Brescia and Cremona, where this was made, wait for it, were north of 500 in 1,000 people. So more than half the population of these towns and cities died. That means that unlike smaller plagues, which then as now are most damaging to the poorest communities. So if you have a plague, most epidemiologists agree that plagues in the medieval and Renaissance and early Baroque periods, if they were south of, say, 25% of the population, then it affected basically the poorest of the poor. But once it gets up above 35%, basically the whole structure of society breaks down and everybody starts dying in equal numbers. And that's what happened in Cremona. And writing in the middle of our pandemic now, and the kind of numbers we're looking at now, and then looking at the early 17th century, it really does one make to stop and think. But I think what I wanted to begin with was the idea of what an instrument represents. I've just been talking about disease-ridden northern Italy in 1629. Well, that's the date on this instrument. I think it's pretty fair to say that this was probably one of the last instruments on which Girolamo worked before he died. And also, to kind of, the thing which I find very emotional is that father and son collaborated on this violin. And then Niccolo found himself rather abruptly alone in the workshop. And not only was he the only maker in the workshop, the Amati workshop, but the plague had ripped through the entire instrument-making community in Cremona. Suddenly, he was the dominant violin maker in the city. I just wanted to leave that there, is because it seems kind of fascinating to me that I've talked about more some quite prosaic things to do with instruments, but that's rather dramatic. And although I've been playing regularly on this instrument for over 6 years, that was the first time I'd really unpacked that bit of history, and to find that this beautiful object carries that troubled beginning is very moving. So I want to move into something to do with cycles. And the cycle I want to talk about, I've sent you a link to it, is a cycle by a slightly mysterious composer. The title is worth reading out, and don't worry if you don't speak Latin. This Latin is so bad that actually it's almost untranslatable. The full title it's by Johann Joseph Vilsmayr, who is from 1663 to 1722. And the full title of the piece is Artificiosus Concentus pro canona distributus sex partes su Partias a vilino solo con basso belle imitante. And then there's a dedication. Celsissimo Reverendissimo Principio ad Domino Francesco Antonio Archiepiscopo Salzburgensis sedis Aspolitico Lego nato Geminii primati I Principi ab Harnac etc. Principi ac Domino sua Clementissimo. And then it says who it's from. Dedicatus a Ioanno Josefo Vilsmayr Celsitudinis sua cubiclario et aulae musico anno Domini 1715. So it's worth saying that enormous dedications on the title pages of pieces in the 17th century are nothing particularly new, but just to give you a little bit of music to set us off, the opening prelude which begins the set sounds like this, just a little bit of music in here. So that's the opening of the first of the 6 partias, which is another word for partita or suites, or as he says in the dedication, parts that make up this cycle. And I want to explore it a little bit because there's issues that come from this which speak to what does it mean to select a group of pieces. And for me, these pieces offer kind of an amazing bridge from the great flowering of, let's say, use the word German-speaking solo music of the end of the 17th century, to the more philosophical masterpieces which emerged in the 1720s. So that basically means from the language of, say, Bibber, Heinrich Bibber, and other late 17th century German-speaking composers. And the most important for the violin probably would be in England, 2 Germans, the earliest of which is the Lübeck-born violinist Thomas Balthasar, and Nicola Matthäus. And in Germany, Johannes Walter, who you may have come across his extraordinary, enormous cycle of pieces called Hortulus Cellicus, which literally is the idea of a garden of pieces for violin and continuo, perhaps with the most amazing imitations, an enormous piece, about nearly 2 hours long. So that's the German-speaking music of the late 17th century. And of course, the more philosophical things I'm talking about, all of those pieces tend to use imitation, lots of drama more important, not more than content, but they tend to be driven by decoration, if you like. Whereas if you think about what Bach would do in 1720 and Telemann will do in 1735, I don't think it is generalizing to say that these are, if you like, more philosophical. And what's fascinating for me about this Vilsmayr set is it seems to be a kind of link between the two of them. It shares both, if you like, the kind of rhetorical dash and bravado of the earlier stuff and the more considered playing of the 1720s, musical philosophy, if you like. Now that dedication I read out is excruciatingly subservient. It's addressed to his employer, the Archbishop of Salzburg. Where's the name here? Yes, Francesco Antonio, who of course was a prince bishop. He wasn't just the archbishop, he was the local ruler. And addressed, of course, as you heard, as Reverendissimo, the most reverend, and he gives his whole list of titles. But what I wanted to point out is the bit that he probably hoped that his dedicatee and the employer would never read, which ends, you might remember, in Latin it says, Celsidudinis suae cubiculario et aulae musico, which translates literally as from the heights of his chamber to the music hall. Literally from his little bedroom to the halls where music is made. I wouldn't read too much into the fact that he, like many composers at the time, used an odd, queasy mixture of Italian and Latin. Pietro Locatelli, who's published his great set of Latte del Violino in Amsterdam about 10 years after this, was prone to absolute word salads of Italian and Latin. Not entirely surprising, bearing in mind that musicians have always expressed themselves as Italian, and Catholic musicians went to church the whole time. They heard Latin most days of the week. So it's not an Italian and Latin are close enough that they bleed into each other. So the title, for instance, of Locatelli's Il Labirinto Armonico Facilius Adius Difficilius Exius is half in Italian, the harmonic labyrinth, and then it zooms into Italian, easy to get into, difficult to get out of. But the most important thing for me is that Vilsmayr has told us that he wrote this music to be in and played it in his cubicularius, his bedroom. And those of you who did Latin at school remember that the old Latin for bedroom is cubicle. This is music which has been written, conceived in intimate, sequestered seclusion. Now, some of you might remember that if you look at the manuscript of Bach's solo partitas, which were written in 1720, so that's 5 years after this, they have a rather odd, deliberate grammatical error on the title page, where it apparently says in Italian 6 solos. Well, 6 solos in Italian should be sei soli. But it doesn't say that. It says sei solo. Now, Bach would never get basic Latinate grammar wrong because he matriculated in Latin and Greek by his early teens. So not making a Latin word agree would never be anything apart from deliberate. Because what's buried in that is German. If you say the German as being sei solo, then it works out as almost being an order, be alone. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is to think about what was happening with string instruments, but most particularly the string instruments of the violin family, which, unlike the instruments of the gamba family, which had always been associated with, if you like, the more elevated environment in which music was made, it had taken the violin some time to extract itself from the bawdy houses, the taverns, the pubs, which it was associated until the late 17th century. And if you go down the road from here to the Wallace collection when it reopens next week and walk through the literally hundreds of paintings by what we might describe as Flemish genre artists from the 17th century. And you'll see again and again and again, the violin is played in the most disreputable environments. It's usually with people drinking a lot of beer or telling what appear to be really, really bad jokes. But it moved from there, and this music is, if you like, part of the evidence of it moving from that rather wanton environment to a more secluded, considered form of music making, a parallel, if you like, to the act of reading alone, as people began to actually learn to think about what to do in domestic environments. Now, I have talked about it before, so I'm not going to show you the visual, but I have mentioned the first page of John Playford's 1683 division violin, depicting a gentleman playing his violin happily at home by himself. And the idea that happiness was to be found playing the violin or a musical instrument by yourself. And if you read Samuel Pepys's violin diary, who, by the way, only ever plays the violin in disreputable circumstances. In his case, the only evidence we have of him playing the violin was when he spent time on a Navy ship and played on the fiddle then. He was a gamba player. So you'll read descriptions of him working out, actually puzzling out what music making could happen by himself in the home. But the reason I'm going around in circles like this is I don't have any problem with saying that Vilsmayr seems to be saying to us he found happiness in just that way. Because here's what's always interesting. When you're choosing to explore a composer, is how much do we know about them? And of course, we often, as musicians, we find ourselves in an odd position, which is we speak a language which is not always acknowledged to be a language. On the wall to the side of me here, if I read, there's a quote from Benjamin Britten, which I find very inspiring. A lot of people don't notice it on the wall of this gallery. It says, "I do not think easily in words because words are not my medium." This is from Benjamin Britten, who was one of the most literary composers we ever had in this country. But his point was a simple one, which was we as musicians speak and sing music as our first language. And if we believe it's a language, that means we have to believe and trust what it is saying to us. Now, so my feeling is from the years spent studying and performing and recording Vilsmayr, and for that dedication, that he found happiness at the violin. Because we basically know nothing about him apart from the fact that he was a member of the Hofkapelle in Salzburg from 1689 until he died in 1722. And we know he must have been successful there because the accounts of the Kapelle show that he had successive salary increases up to his death. So we know also that means that if he was working in Salzburg, in the Kapelle, he would have come under the influence and collaborated with the most famous of Salzburg musicians until the Mozart family arrived there. Because, of course, they were not Austrian, they were Bavarian originally. And that was, the musician I'm now talking about, is the Kapellmeister, Heinrich Ignaz Franz Bieber, who was actually given the title Bibber von Bibben, the Bibber of Bibber. And aspects of Vilsmayr's writing, not all of them, betray the influence of this most celebrated musician, Bieber. The most famous set of pieces that Bieber ever wrote was the Mystery Sonatas, the 16 sonatas relating to a whole series of events in the life of Christ, ending up with the movement, the one solo movement from the set, the last movement, which I played you a bit of just then, which was the last of these, Der Schutzengel als begleitet des Menschen, the guardian angel, companion of mankind. The reason I'm bringing up Bieber here and his influence was that the most commentated of the possible links between Vilsmayr and Bieber is the use of scordatura. Now, this word is often translated and viewed as, quote, the de or retuning of string instruments. Now, That's in many ways a misunderstanding, and it's an anachronistic misunderstanding, which is a result of historically its more recent use for caricatured effects on the instrument. And the most famous of these, of course, is in the second movement, the scherzo movement of Mahler's Fourth Symphony, which apparently, where the violin is tuned up a third, the whole violin, and his whole point was he wanted the violin to sound, quote, screeching as if death had struck up. He told Bruno Walter that this was the devil striking up. And so the whole idea, which of course Saint-Saëns had would do as well in his Danse Macabre, was that the violin screwed up tight was the instrument of the devil. In fact, Ramus, in the libretto that he wrote for Stravinsky's Soldier Sale, you remember this? Although Stravinsky doesn't use scordatura in that piece, Ramus actually talks at one point about screwing the violin up tight, the idea that the violin tight was something associated with the diabolic. But we need to back up a little bit, because in the 1600s and early 1700s, there was no such association with that word. The very word itself, scordatura, only means one thing. If you look at it carefully, it just means stringing the instrument, chording the instrument, as in chord being, not in the musical sense, a filament. And every chordophone, and by chordophone I mean an instrument which makes its sounds by having strings on it, every chordophone, bowed, plucked, or struck, has, as part of its history, many tunings, and most of its history would have been used in different tunings within a very short time or at the same time. So anyone who spent any time going to concerts given by, say, roots musicians in the US will be very familiar of the kind of stories which guitar singers will tell what to the audience. And often what's going on while they tell the stories is they're retuning the instrument to the next tuning for the next song for whatever reason. Whether if they're going to adjust a banjo for if they're going to perform something like Rocky Mountain Breakdown, for instance. So these tunings will be used for two different reasons on plucked instruments today. One is to reach certain harmonies easier, and the other, which is vital for all chordophones, is that when you retune instruments, it brings a slightly different color to them for a variety of reasons. And today is going to be a bit practical. I'm going to show some of these with you, the instrument. But it's worth noting that particularly on the violin, because the violin table is so flexible, there's nothing holding up the top of the violin. A lot of people seem to think the sound post inside the violin holds it up. It doesn't. The only thing that holds up the violin... I can leave it. I'm really sorry. The Academy Internet went down for a moment there. Can people hear me again now? Can someone give me a thumbs? I'm really sorry. Everything tanked on me. Okay. So just go back a little bit there. So because of the flexibility of the top of the violin, it means different tunings affect the architecture and the airspace of the box of the instrument. So if you put more pressure here on this side, so if I tune the E string up, then it pushes that side down of the instrument, which changes the shape not only of the box of the instrument and the various tensions, but actually changes the configuration of the internal acoustic. Think how much the acoustics of a room are changed, if, for instance, even if you just open a door of it. Now, of course, the GDAE tuning we're all familiar with. that was used from the very beginning of the violin's modern history. And by modern history, I begin with that standardization of form which Andrea Amati was responsible for in the 1560s. So that use of tuning was there. But if we look at the broad evolution of the string instruments, the violin family, right up till today, and we'll swiftly see that away from what we now call the classical limits of the instrument, which would not be recognized, to be honest, in the 16th or 17th century at all, these distinctions between disciplines which emerge from, linked to, or emerged, or sometimes from the classical tradition. Many successful traditions and practices of the instrument have evolved in the far north of Europe, and particularly across the Americas, which don't use that standard tuning. I'll illustrate a couple of those in a minute. So there's an idea amongst anthropologists, which they sometimes call the anthropological distance principle, which I kind of like, it's useful, which is that the best way to see the oldest version of any practice or cultural activity is to go as far away from its source as possible, to travel to the furthest place that it traveled away from the source, because the furthest place it traveled away from the source will be the place where it has evolved the least. So my favorite illustration of this, which sounds like it's completely nuts, is a book I found when I was a kid, written by a young British woman in the 1890s, early 1900s, called I Married the Klondike, which was about a woman who couldn't find a husband. It's her autobiography in England. So she actually organized for herself to be a mail order bride for a gold prospector in the Yukon. And when she got there and married this man she'd never met, she discovered that the people in the Yukon were still dancing minuets. Anybody who spent any time in, for instance, the remote parts of, say, northern Minnesota in the US will know, for instance, there are bits of that area where you'll find places which are more Danish than Denmark, but they're a kind of memory of 19th century Denmark, if you like. So in these traditions which emerged in America and in Europe, we can hear echoes of the richness of tunings used in violins in southern Europe in the 17th or 18th century. Now, the most obvious of these is in America, for instance, the bluegrass tradition uses, for instance, this tuning. It's a very simple reason. The simple reason for using that is, one, the brightness. The other is a simple one, the tuning for the bottom two strings. You can use the same fingering on the bottom and the top of the instrument. It's extremely practical. In Norway, the Hardanger tradition is completely dominated by Scordatura tuning, although because of the smaller instruments, they use a higher A, but still consider it to be an A. It's usually between a tone and a minor third up from what we consider to be A. And the most commonly tuned there is A, E, A. So you just heard A, D, A, E, A, E. The most common tuning for the Hardanger tradition, although there are about 10 or 15 they use, is this. Is A, E, A, D, which gives this kind of interesting gives a very, very particular clang to the instrument. So any notion we have of our GDAE as being completely standardized is a rather short-sightedly classical one. But, of course, by 1715, when Vilsmayr's set was published, it was home. So he describes this set as being sex partes sous Partias, 6 sections or suites. And they used the following tunings using the following moves. And this may sound ridiculous, but I want to show you the moves. And thank you. for Nina for pointing out something. I really should have remembered that. The Indian classical music uses tuning similar to bluegrass. That's a really good point. So you could actually even, because of course the use of Western instruments, violins in particular, arrived in India so early. It's very, very likely the violins were arriving with the Portuguese in India by the early 1600s. And so you could even go farther. You could argue that many of the postural things we see of the extraordinary, amazing violins of the Indian classical tradition are also linked to historical practices of holding the instrument. So that's really fantastic, an illustration of, not this illustrating my point, but think of that amazing spread. Okay, so let's actually go through the tunings and see what happens. So but what happens is this. The reason I want to demonstrate this is I want to think about the simplest things that happen with cycles of pieces. Right? So the first one is the home tuning. The second one, the top string comes down a tone. I'm not going to play any music yet. So the difference between what you just heard and this tuning, and you'll notice that gives a certain kind of, not boxy, but a kind of pepper-like quality to the top of the instrument. So that's the top string, which I will not call the E string, coming down one tone. The third, the top string comes down another tone. So that means that if I was to play major thirds on the top two strings, it will come out as a unison. But if I play fifths, so what you're hearing as a major and minor third is played using a perfect fifth and a minor sixth. So that's the third of them. Then really interesting things start to happen. The A string, by the way, remains absolutely constant. The fourth goes from this sound, then the bottom two strings come up, and the top string goes up as well. So there we have now the Hardanger kind of tuning. And as we go past that 2/3 point, the fingerings, the tunings unwind again. From that to, now we go. So we go from the tightest of the tunings into a looser one. Bottom two strings down a tone to G, D, A, G, and as you might imagine, the sixth of the set goes back up to E. Now, the reason I wanted to do that is, if you think of a cycle of pieces, I'm going to talk about keys next, but one of the narratives of the piece is that little arch of tunings, which of course is offset the dramatic moment, as you can imagine, you'd expect from painting because of the golden section. That dramatic moment is between the fourth, going into the fourth of the set, from the darkest tuning to the brightest tuning. And that gives us a little bit of a doorway into the set. And it's worth remembering that when we have groups of pieces, until quite recently, groups of pieces were designed to be appreciated, heard as a set. And this is the case whether it's the Bach-Brandenburg concertos or Beethoven, the Corelli Opus 5 sonatas, or Corelli Trio sonatas, or often groups of 3 or 6. We'll get back to that. So the equivalent of a set of pieces of music would be a group of paintings. If you were to think of a really dramatic equivalent to this from the, say, the 17th century, I would think it would be the set of 24 paintings which were produced from the workshop of Peter Paul Rubens in between 1621 and 25, the apotheosis of Henry IV and the proclamation of the regency of Mary de Medici, 14th of May 1610. Now, this is 24 paintings, and I chose this idea, and I'll put an illustration of those in the resource page when that goes up later, is because this is going to sound rather strange. If you go to the Louvre, you can see these paintings all in one room, and you see them at once, and then you move around them, but they're all in one room. They're designed to be appreciated in one event, and interestingly, the events they depict happened all, whether they're real or not, because some of them are events on Earth and some of them are events literally of Henri IV going to heaven after he was assassinated, depict one day, 14th of May, 1610. So that it's not a contradiction. The idea that in the cycle, time goes horizontally and vertically at the same time can be reflected in the fact that this sequence of enormous sequence of paintings, if you lay them out on the floor, they cover a large hall. But they themselves, they deal with a very tight area of time, but with huge variety. But if you think of listening to a cycle of pieces or a cycle of poetry or looking at a cycle of paintings, as well as the big shape, the things that stick out most are going to be moments of drama and particularly pivotal changes. And the reason I wanted to do the tunings is that that pivotal change is from that dark tuning, the one with the tuning from the G, D, A, C, to the bright tuning, A, E, A, D, the violin literally raising itself. Now, it would be a very hardened player or listener who didn't notice the effect that effectively this is what you might call a sun coming out effect. The tunings have moved darker and darker, and then there's a moment you'd recognize. It would be in Hebrew, it would be the yei or, in Latin, dixique Deus fiat lux et factor ex lux. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. We have to deal with the fact that a musician coming from a Catholic country, working for an archbishop in the background of someone like Vilsmayr, this is his every day. These are the generic things, the way the world is approached. So I'm not stretching it to say that if you think of the beginning of Haydn's creation, where you have that moment of God said, and there was let be light, and literally this amazing, brilliant chord from the chaos before, that's something which everybody would recognize from the music. They wouldn't even necessarily need to hear the words. Let's now just swing across from this into the question of key color, and I'm just going to use somebody else again to express this. Now, the French composer Marc-Antoine Charpentier in 1682 wrote a règle de composition, rules of composition. You could choose any number of authorities between the 1650s up to the 1730s, and each of them will give you a slightly different but similar in tenor attitude to what I'm going to talk about now. I'm just focusing right now on the move from C minor to D minor to D major, because the third partita, where that tuning, the dark tuning happens, is C minor. The fourth partita is D major. Now, relative to the change of tunings, they're going from this chord, this key, to is as striking a change from dark to light as you could imagine within the consonant approach of the Middle Baroque, as we're talking about here. So, Marc-Antoine Charpentier described C minor as being obscure and sad, and D major, the association here will be something which we might find strange, was joyously warlike. We don't now associate war with joy, but it's rather different. Martial triumph was celebrated in the 17th century. I was thinking another biblical association might be the moment from okay, I need to talk about typologies here a little bit, which is the way we associate one text, we map it onto another. So within the Bible, so the "Let there be light" is the third verse of Genesis. Literally, the third sentence of the Bible is light, but that pushes forward to the great prophetic line from Isaiah: "Populus qui ambulabat in tenebris videt lucem magnum." The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath light shined. It's not something which is complicated to get a hand on. Sorry, drop all this on the floor. Where's the rest of my text gone? Having a slight personal moment here, excuse me. Just need to hang. There it is. Okay, sorry. Now, I'm just going to go through the key sequence. So the full sequence of keys used in Vilsmayr's set really maps fascinatingly onto that scordatura shape. Now, I just want to suggest something abstract. So if you imagine that shape of scordatura from the home to the home with a kind of arch. Now, in your mind, imagine a second arch in counterpoint to it. And I'm going to use Charpentier's attributes of keys. So the first partita is A major, so it's joyful and pastoral. That's this beginning I played you. The second partita is B flat major, which Charpentier describes as, interestingly, magnificent and joyful. The third, the C minor, was that, already gave it to you, obscure and sad. So we get, for instance, movements. Where's the most? What's the scordatura is too complicated. Oh, this kind of thing. It's heartbreaking in some ways. The fourth of them, mapping onto the tuning change, is in D major, joyous and very warlike. The fifth, G minor, which was serious and magnificent, and the sixth, again, joyful and pastoral. So one of the ways you can find your way into the set is, before you've heard any music, is the association of the keys overlaid into the different coloristic and almost all audio-visual effects of the changings of tunings. So let's go to the next thing I want to talk about, which is really, really important, which is a very simple concept, which is fundamental to all form and architecture, really, until, perhaps even now, in our centuries. And that's what you might call the rule of six. In the 1st century BC, a man whose full name was Marcus Vitruvius Polo, who's Vitruvius to you and me, wrote, "Mathematicians have said that the perfect number is 6, because this number is composed of integral parts suited numerically to their method of reckoning. And further, as the foot is 1/6 of a man's height, the height of a body is expressed in the number of feet being limited to 6. So the two things he's saying is that the number 6 is one of the divisions that we use of the human body. Man, the measure of all things, that 1 foot is 1/6 the height of the human body. And the other thing is that the thing which makes 6 exciting, and the reason every piece of music, every building, every painting, every instrument dialogues with it, is the simple observation which Vitruvius has made, which is that 1 + 2 + 3 equals 6, which equals 1 × 2 × 3. Whichever way you assemble the integers, it adds up with the same notion. It makes it one of the perfect numbers. It was the reason that when Rabelais wrote his great works in the 16th century, he came up with the notion of the thing which is beyond the perfection of six, a word we still use to this day, which is seventh heaven. That will be the thing which is so good, it's almost too good. It's beyond the perfection of six. And of course, the two fundamental numbers within 6, 3 and 2, map onto each other interestingly. And if you think about the way we divide up music constantly, until comparatively recently, we either divide it in simple or compound time, and these have an interesting and complex relationship with each other. They're either groups of 2 or groups of 3. And of course, the cycle itself is divided, as I already showed, in 2 groups, with the dark to light in the middle. Now, it's worth saying that the way that divisions within cycles was notated was often different. So in Corelli, if you take his trio sonatas, he divides them clearly between 2 sets. One set of 6, because in the trio sonatas there's 2 sets of 6 to be considered together. So you get 6 da Chiesa sonatas, church sonatas, and 6 da Camera sonatas. Whereas Bach, of course, plays around it in another way, which is he interleaves them. So we have, Bach writes 3 church sonatas. The second church sonata of his set, the A minor sonata, and the third of the church sonatas, C major. And then against that, you have the 3 da Camera sonatas, the B minor sonata, the second of the da Camera sonatas, the D minor sonata, and the third, the E major partita. But Bach, of course, couldn't resist the temptation of not separating them, but to interleave them, which makes something very interesting happen. 2 sets of 3 made one by being pushed together. Now, here's where a composer like Vilsmayr gets interesting, because his division is obscure, but it only becomes clear when you step back from the set. So at this moment, I think it's worth thinking about, when you're looking at a set of sonatas, particularly a set designed to be appreciated as a set, how do you find your way into it? My way has always been to kind of build charts like this. And the charts there's nothing precise to be seen there. They give me an overview of all the elements, keys, time signatures, names of movements. And one of the things you're going to be looking for, because in classical music, say most classical music until the 19th century was composed of what was fundamentally dance elements, even when it wasn't dance music. You're looking for moments of things being shared and things not being shared. So, for instance, an example in Bach would be, we have a couple of jigs. So Bach ends his cycle, which clearly has a relationship to the jig halfway through the cycle. And the glorious major of the E major, if you like, cross-pollinates, speaks to the earlier jig. You're always going to be looking the way things interlock. So if you look at Vilsmayr, for instance, he comes up with a rather interesting gesture, which is there are a set of varied movements which are marked in 3 possible ways. One is marked Ciccona, a chaconne, one is marked as Passacaglia, and one is marked aria variata. And what's really interesting about this is the first of them, the first chaconne, which I'll just find here, comes in the second partita, and it is bom, bim, bom. If I show you, I'll just tune it. So it's this. And it is the theme and two variations and a return to the theme. So fundamentally, that's a group of four. The next, the Passacaglia, just going to find that, appears in, where's it gone? Here it is, in the fourth with its, this tuning. Sorry. All right. It's roughly good. So likewise, this one is still in three. Didn't change the strings, right? So. And set of variation, and it gets more and more dramatic. Etc. And this has so fundamentally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, has 8 sections. So you can see it's grown from 4 to 8. That's the fourth partita. And the last set of variations in the last one, which is the standard tuning, is a big set of variations which ends with a big arpeggiated and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's 12 variations long. So we go 4, 8, 12, alternating the segues by the sixth, the fourth, and the second partita, and each of these end the movements. If you arrange those movements, think of them stacked up, basically it's this shape. So across the structure of the pieces, there, if you like, is a growing object. I like to think of it as almost as if you see it on, you might be able to see it here. I've drawn it on the thing here. There. So there's the big structure, and there is going from here to here is the growing set of variations. So almost, I'll include the picture later, almost it's dominant. And if you were thinking architecturally, you could say it's a bit like putting a dome on a building, which of course means precisely that. So that's another way into the structure. Yet another way is, what are the things that they have in common? Well, each of them begins with a prelude. The first of these first four are marked prelude adagio, and the last two are marked prelude arpeggio, which interestingly, he always spells arpeggio with an H, and the last one, prelude allegro. And if you ask yourselves, what does a prelude do? Well, as in every composer of the Baroque, basically the prelude establishes the key, that's the obvious thing, explores the fullest tessitura and gamut of the piece. So it's in all of Bach's preludes, in his solo works, you'll find the preludes have the biggest range of notes which is going to be listened to. But the most important thing when it comes down to tuning and key color is that preludes allow both the player and listener to accustom themselves to the new tempering of tuning and color without being belabored too much with too much musical material. So for instance, the prelude for the last movement is literally, the last set is literally just simple chords. So we have the tonic, then we have the subdominant, then he finds itself the dominant. So basically, a simple exploration of tonic, subdominant, and tonic with no apparent thematic material. If you like, it's just, you could even see it almost as being in a long meal, as being the sorbet you need to cleanse the palate if you're going from, say, if you're not a vegetarian, if you're going from, say, eating a steak into something more refined. But it's also worth saying that, this is going to sound really odd, the beginnings and endings were clearly very important to Vilsmayr. Now, you may think this sounds really weird, because to modern ears, from the 18th century onwards, we became very used to the idea that pieces of music would have codas and finales. But instrumental work forms in the late 17th century were much less concerned with kind of finials on things, particularly in dance forms. And it's really interesting to see some of the gambits our composer here uses to bring a suite to a noteworthy conclusion, as opposed to just finishing. I mean, every single movement of the Bach sonatas and partitas just finishes, even the chaconne. The ones which come closest to having an ending are the ends of the three preludes, but those aren't endings, they're simply set up the dance movement that follows. Bach's dance movements, or allegros, just ends. There's never a big chord at the end. In Vilsmayr's case, three of the groups of suites are rounded out with a gesture which breaks the form and actually announces we are at the end here. This is something which I'm going to say Biber, who may or may not have been his teacher, never does this. So I'll just give you an illustration of a couple of those. The first suite ends with what might seem to be one of those dances. It's a French jig, spelled G-U-I-Q-U-E. So which repeats, then the second half, which repeats, but that will be the normal ending. But that's tied over into a movement marked finale. So we have the which ends. It even ends with a virtuoso up-bow staccato, which goes further. That up-bow staccato is a quote from a previous movement. 3 movements earlier, we have. So he's done almost a Beethovenian gesture of a coda which is referring back to the earlier point. The fifth partita ends with an extraordinary movement called retirada, literally a withdrawal. This is actually, let me just tune the instrument. There we are. Now, that was a title which Bieber had used in a very famous piece, Den Nachtwächter, the Night Watch, which ends with just such a movement. It's Bieber's serenade for a string ensemble. Now, this movement, in Vilsmayr's case, is one of the most dynamically contrasted in any of the cycle. It begins piano, then forte, it's worth pointing out how dramatic that is, because I want to come back to drama a little bit later. And then, after a series of petit reprises, and a petit reprise is when you finish a movement, and then you see a little R written over the last 4 bars, which means you play it again. But then, after that, there's a coda. And remember, in the previous one, I've been talking about how Vilsmayr referred back. That ending refers directly back to the opening of the whole set, of the whole Partia. So that's another way of showing the end. He's showing a unity. And the last dramatic setting up of an end comes in the last partitas. I need to retune. I want you to think a little about silence. A really, really rare thing in 17th century and early 18th century solo music is silence, as opposed to pauses, notated silence. So this movement, which is the penultimate movement of the last of the set, which sets up that final set of variations I already been talking about, the first of the two halves of this includes two dramatically notated silences. There's a jig that does this. So we have a notated 2 beats rest into an unaccompanied piece. Now, in the following movement, which is actually entitled Echo, this happens to this material. So I'll do the dynamics. So we have a series, the 2 rests in that first movement have been opened out, multiplied, and then echo effects have been put into it. Now, successive generations of Salzburg composers loved these kind of spatial effects. Bieber's son, Heinrich, taught Leopold Mozart, Mozart's father. And in 1777, Wolfgang Amadeus' most Bieberesque work, which is a piece called Notturno for 4 string orchestras, each with 2 horns, a piece I've never heard played. It was written for the very same spaces that Vilsmayr had played and worked in, and it uses effects marked the same way. It has the word echo marked on it, on the echoes. And of course, Vivaldi famously wrote at least one violin concerto where there is an ensemble at the back of the hall who echoes what's going on at the front. But for me, this composer uses it in a very theatrical way, recalling a very particular theatrical device. And as I'm English, I need to illustrate this from the most famous Jacobean tragedy, John Webster's Duchess of Malfi. This is where the two lead characters, Antonio and Delio, find themselves in a chasm. So this is what happens. Delio, now the echo hath caught you, Antonio. It groaned, and methought, and gave a very deadly accent. Echo, deadly accent. I told you it was a pretty one. You may make it a huntsman, or a falconer, a musician, or a thing of sorrow. Echo, a thing of sorrow. So what you can hear happens there is that musicians have a tendency to think echo effects when they're used in Baroque music is simply a question of doing things quietly. But it's very clear from looking at any early theatre that echo effects are the idea that, for instance, you reveal that a character is going to die, which is what's happening in this play, or that a character is guilty of something. So if someone announces, in Dryden uses this effect, will announce, no, I'm not a liar, then the echo will go, liar, 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 etc. And this is the gambit which Vilsmayr is using, although admittedly his is rather happier. Last thing to point out is that that movement ends with another whole bar of notated silent, which has been incorrectly notated as being 12 eighth note long, 12 quavers long. The composer forgot that he began the movement with an upbeat violin, which means that that last note should be 11 quavers long, as anybody who's done a music theory exam knows. But don't worry, this is a mistake that Bach made. The end of the chaconne begins on the second beat of the bar. And if you look at the very end of the chaconne, Bach makes this mistake, if it is a mistake, only once. And the last bar of the chaconne has a full 3 beats in it. It should either be 1 beat long or a whole bar tied to 1 beat. So he's chosen to do that. Just getting back to the general things, of course, these are suites. So the majority of the movements heard in the collection are dances. Now, I'm really interested in lists. And if you find yourself working on something where things repeat, it's a good idea to write a shopping list of what you have. So, for instance, we have 5 sarabands, 3 gavottes, 12 minuets, watch that, 12 minuets in 6 pieces, 4 jigs, 1 passe-pied, 1 chaconne, 1 courante, 2 canarios, 1 brunada, one Passacaglia, one Rigodon, and one Bourrée. It's really interesting that the minuet has become dominant. It's newly fashionable. It was beginning, if you think that in Bach's sonatas and partitas, there's only one, or maybe you can call it two minuets. Here we have 12 minuets in 6 pieces. And of course, the minuet was going to be the center of Austrian music making within 30 or 40 years. I want to talk about a couple of the dances to kind of bring ourselves towards a close. There are 2 dances which are really of note. The first of them is a dance about which absolutely nothing is known at all. Sometimes you'll find yourself facing a musical form where you, in my case, I go to every shelf I can in the house trying to work out where it's come from. I'm completely foxed. And that's the case in this 4th partita. One second. In the 4th partita, there's a movement called a brunada. And it's between a stealthy minuet and a saraband. So it's before it, there's this minuet. And then a very melancholy adagio. Sorry, the tune. So we have this saraband after it. Sorry, I forgot what tuning I was using there. And then this is the brunado. We know nothing about this dance form, but it's clear that it was a complicated, kind of syncopant, gone wrong gavotte. Listener and player, or not many dancer, would be quite hard pressed to find a downbeat. And I think that's probably the joke. If you are interested in this kind of tradition in the 17th century tradition of violin writing, you'll find that Vilsmayr's Dresden-based contemporary Paul van Westhoff used a very similar technique in one of his jigs, in his famous Allemanden, Couranten, Sarabanden and Jigen for solo violin without continuo around about the same time, which has movements where the listener hears dee bop bee bop bee bop bee bop ba bop bee bop bum, and the rhythm is bee ba bee ba bee ba bee. It's offbeat, but you never hear the offbeat being resolved. It's an in-joke for the player, if you like. But for me, the dance movement which I find the most charming is one of the the canarios. And that's what I want to kind of sum this up, bring this to an end. We're talking about this. So the canario is the penultimate movement of this 4th suite. As you can hear, it's in the bright tuning, and we're in A major. And that's one case where all the trills I played are notated. So, like the bird, this dance, which is a kind of jig, which is full of little odd accents, seems to have originated in the Canary Islands. And Vilsmayr, quite uniquely amongst his colleagues, took the challenge, it seems to me, of incorporating both the dance and the sound of the bird, the canary. And the dance historically is not associated with the bird. Now, Shakespeare summed up the character of the dance well a number of times in his plays, but particularly in All's Well That Ends Well. It had been, the dance was already popular a century before this piece was written. Shakespeare wrote, make you dance canary with sprightly fire and motion. But Vilsmayr, as I already hinted, couldn't resist the challenge of incorporating the bird song in the dance. Bach has a canario in the Goldberg variations, but it's just the jig rhythm. So the bird, in Latin, avis canaria or passer canarius, which translates literally as sparrow from the Canaries, had been unknown in Europe until Spanish ships trading across the Atlantic in the late 16th century brought it back. And it became celebrated for its song in this culture, which was absolutely obsessed with, I'm afraid to say, with the capture and training of every possible wild songbird to sing on command. There were so many books published from the late 1500s through to the late 1700s, teaching people how to train their birds to sing certain songs. In 1622, a man called Vincenzo Leonardi worked with a painter and engraver called Giovanni Pietro Olina to publish the Uccelliera, the aviary, and it gave precise instructions how you could entice and dispose canaries to sing, and said that some, this was a quote, some coddle them, the birds, and pamper them with crumbs of sugar. Some cover the cage with chickweed for greenery, this being a herb dear to all the little birds that sing. So this is me and my imagination. It kind of takes me back to where I began the whole thing, with Vilsmayr by himself in his Cubicularius. I like the idea that perhaps he had a canary of his own, and perhaps it was a happy enough bird and it liked to sing while he played. So I imagine him smiling in his little bedroom, he called it, his Cubicularis Chalcidinis, the heights of his bedroom, soaring away while the sparrow, this bird which came from the Canary Islands, is sometimes called the Fortunate Isles, sang away to its heart's content. And to me, that sort of is what the music feels like to play. Now, the reason I wanted to do this was because one of the concerns which a lot of people have, and it's interesting that people write this to me a great deal, is the concern as to the relationship between the repertoire which they choose to play and the repertoire which is, if you like, seen as being necessary. I was just giving a talk here with the pianist Daniel Ben Pinar, a great pianist who teaches here. And what's really interesting about his work is he's recorded all the Beethoven sonatas, all the Mozart sonatas, all the Schubert sonatas, the Bach 48, the complete Bach partitas, all the Brahms late piano music. He's just finishing recording, wait for it, all 40 Haydn piano sonatas. But alongside those, he's also recorded cycles on the piano of all the William Byrd keyboard music, all the Orlando Gibbons keyboard music, cycles of unknown 17th century music, and of comparatively unknown early 20th century South African composers, and treats everything the same. And I think the exciting thing about taking on a cycle is that then you have the opportunity of taking on a whole world. And the good thing about, perhaps he wouldn't think that's a good thing, but the really good thing about Vilsmayr was the exception of these 6 pieces and one other manuscript piece which is survived in Dresden. This is not only all the music we have, it's all we know of the composer. It is their representation. Just as much as we find our way, for me, I find my way into Mozart through the sets of pieces, say the cycles of piano, violin sonatas I play. And I think all of us have a bit of a challenge, which is how do we negotiate between the things which are required for us to do and the things which will be interesting to do. So, for instance, if you're a violinist, I'm sorry to talk violin so much, do you play and study the 5 Mozart concertos as a group? And they were composed as a set in a very short period of time. Or do you simply play the concertos which are seen as being, to use the word, repertoire, which tend to be dominantly the 5th concerto, the 3rd, and slightly less the 4th concerto. The 1st concerto is somehow not considered part of repertoire, and the 2nd is regarded, wait for it, as being too easy, so therefore that doesn't count either. But what's interesting is when you put them all together, you can see just as much as in these pieces how they all generate each other. They are all commentary on similar things. And whether or not a composer is writing a linked set like this, or a set that simply happens to be written in the same set of manuscript paper and composed at the same time, like Mozart, there's something I think to be gained from it. So what I'm going to do is, I can see people are leaving us, so I'm going to call a halt here. I'm going to drop a note to everybody. You've seen I've already sent some support materials. If you have time to listen to the Vilsmayr set, I think you'd find it interesting. I think you'd actually find it most interesting if you put it on and then don't listen to it, but have it around the house. It's actually music, I think it's worth remembering as a final thing. Music in the 17th century was not designed to be listened to by people who necessarily gave it the attention of silence. And sometimes a huge amount can be intuited from listening to early music when we allowed life to go along next to it, whether it is conversation or wandering around or eating or dancing or talking or anything. And actually, to be honest, this makes quite a lot of sense in this case.